Okay, now, I'm not hopelessly behind, but I'm behind. And given that the lecture notes have been handed out, that's going to give me an opportunity to do a little catch-up. What we're going to do tonight, for sure, is to cover the Gospels, and I hope that we can begin the lectures that will actually get us into the material about Jesus, the birth and infancy narratives. But I'm going to do the Mark lecture and the John lecture, and very briefly just walk you through the the Matthew and Luke lectures, indicating some special material with regard to those materials. So, let's jump into the middle of the page, on page 1 on the lecture 4, the Gospel according to Mark. Having started with the sources for constructing the life and going through the literary relationships and oral tradition that lies behind our Gospels, the question that we now have to do with are the individual Gospels themselves. What can we learn from each of them individually that will help us to understand them as sources for a life of Jesus? Now, you'll have to appreciate that there's a lot of material in these notes. It's very difficult for me to finally decide what really belongs in this class and what just belongs in a survey of Mark, Matthew, that type of thing. But my interest is primarily on these Gospels as sources for our doing the life of Jesus. Now, what insights, I've asked as a secondary question, what insights do we gain from their special interests in recording the material? And these, of course, are the questions of what is known as redaction criticism. That is, redaction criticism, if literary criticism basically has to do with the relationships of the Gospels as they are. Then we spent some time what we call form criticism, which is to get to the oral tradition behind the written Gospels. Once we've looked at that material, now we're back to the written Gospels, but we want to think in terms of the special interests of our evangelists that caused them to shape the Gospels the way they did. And that's what is known as redaction criticism. Now we begin with Mark because of our conviction that Mark came first. He strung the pearls, as it were, with regard to all those materials that were available but had not yet been put into a consecutive life. Nothing quite like Mark had ever been done before. He was, in fact, emulated in a couple of instances. Certainly not altogether so with regard to the Gospel of John. But our concern in particular is with what Mark was trying to do. The question is, when we come to Mark, is it Mark, historian and biographer of Jesus of Nazareth, or Mark, evangelist and theologian for Jesus of Nazareth? And then, of course, can Mark help us with the historical question, now especially the question of a general framework of a life, since he's the one that gave the tradition its narrative form. So we begin with the question of the problem of history in Mark. The problem here goes in several directions. The pericopes in Mark are filled with details of a variety of kinds that demand either an eyewitness recollection or an especially fertile creative imagination on the part of the storyteller. That is, it's filled with the kind of stuff that either comes right from an eyewitness because they remember that kind of thing, or we're dealing with an especially fertile creative imagination. Now, if we decide for the former, that is, that we have eyewitness recollection, does this in fact say anything about the framework itself? If the details within some of these narratives seem to go back to somebody who was on the scene, what does that tell us, or does it, about the general framework, the story that he presents? Well, to put all of this in another way, the question ultimately is, where do Mark's own, or where does his own emphasis lie? In the year 30 with Jesus of Nazareth? In the year 65 with the church in Rome for whom he's writing this gospel? Or is the better answer his interest lies in both Zitzim Leben? And I will finally contend that I think we can make most sense of Mark if we argue the latter. So in this case, let me begin with my conclusions. And the rest of the lecture will be an examination of the data that has led me to these conclusions. I begin by noting an agreement with Ralph Martin in his book, and this is just a book on Mark's being a narrator and theologian, that he entitled the book Mark, Evangelist and Theologian. That's certainly what Mark is. But to say that is not to say that he plays lightly with history. It is precisely the opposite. That is, if his concern is with telling the story of Jesus because he has a specific theological concern in telling that story, that is not to say that he plays lightly with the history. Mark's interest is indeed the year 65, what Jesus means to the church in Rome in the midst of the Neronian persecution. But, and here's the significant point, what Mark wants to say, what he thinks needs to be said, to do this, he tells the story of Jesus. But not as a chronicle, not as a stringing together of the pearls, as it were. But he tells the story of Jesus because he understands Jesus as the exemplar, the historical roots of his, that is, Mark's, but the understanding that he comes from Paul and Peter, from his understanding of the gospel. So Mark's concern is a theological one that has to do with the gospel. But his passion is that the exemplar for understanding that gospel lies with Jesus himself. So he tells the story of Jesus precisely because it is Jesus who is the paradigm for his theological concern. Therefore, history, indeed historicity, is a concern. But not for its own sake. That is, not simply to preserve the past so that it does not get lost. Rather, he narrates history, as almost all such narratives do, for the sake of saying something. That is, he has a genuine theological concern for the church. Therefore, I also think, to continue my conclusions, that Mark thought everything he recorded to be historical. And this especially holds true of the framework, since his story is in fact dependent upon the framework. It's this little conjunction that finally is the key to what I call genuine historicity with regard to the story of Jesus. It's the fact that Mark is the one who gives us the framework. And that Mark's theology demands the historicity of the framework, because it is the framework itself that is essential to the story that he presents. Now, the essential features of the outline, therefore, and I use this language advisedly, the essential features of the outline. That doesn't mean every pericope and everything, you understand, is in chronological order, but we're talking about the essential features of the outline. Those, for him, must have been historical. After all, the very point he's trying to make is dependent upon that little bit of history. And then I go on to note that this would not necessarily hold true of the sequencing within that outline. To illustrate, for example, there is no reason to believe or care that the disparate materials in 2:1 to 3:6, which happens to be a collection of 5 conflict narratives, which basically question Jesus or Jesus' disciples' conduct. There is no reason to believe or care that that collection is in any precise sequence, or that they all happened at this very point in history. For Mark, they illustrate an essential feature of the outline. Whether they all happened in this, bang, 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 it's very clear a collection in which the key to the narratives is this repeated question, why? Why do they do this? Why does Jesus do this? Why do they do things that are not lawful? 4 times in the first 4 narratives, that's the key to the narrative. All of which are conflict between Jesus and the authorities, which Mark is saying, in effect, Jesus gets into trouble very early. And these are the reasons for it. And so he's giving us not so much a chronological sequencing, but a series of narratives that by those narratives tell us what and give why Jesus happens to, in this case, end up in conflict. His interest is that Jesus very early on incurred the wrath of the Pharisees and the Herodians, and that this happened after a period of initial immense popularity, and for these very kinds of reasons. That is what I call framework, and that looks like good history to me. No reason to doubt it at all. But as to whether those 5 happened in that historical sequence, that is something we can never determine. The very way it's constructed indicates that Mark's concern lies with that why question, and not with what happened next, which becomes, for Mark, really an irrelevancy. Well, 2 points, therefore. To say that Mark is an evangelist and theologian does not mean that he invents, twists, or distorts history. Rather, he arranges and thereby interprets history, which is what all good history is about. But secondly, to say that Mark is concerned with history does not mean that his entire arrangement is in precise chronological sequence. On that question, we can never have a final answer. Well, now then, let's look at the data that I see supporting these conclusions. We begin with a word about authorship. Our knowledge of Mark's being the author of the gospel that bears his name actually precedes, that is, it comes from Papias, who wrote around 125, preserved in Eusebius, and Papias actually antedates the first listing of the Gospels in any of the early fathers that indicates that Mark wrote a Gospel. Papias is our very earliest evidence that something comes from Mark. I've given the quotation in full because in this case this is somewhat important to our enterprise. Mark became Peter's interpreter. A very difficult word to translate. Hermeneutes. You recognize hermeneutics from that word. He became Peter's hermeneutes, whatever that means. Translator, interpreter, and wrote accurately all that he remembered, not indeed in order. So, in the year 125, somebody's already telling us that Mark doesn't do it in order. This is the earliest evidence for Mark's gospel, and he says Mark didn't do it in order. Not in order of the things said or done by the Lord. For he had not heard the Lord, nor had he followed him. But later on, as I said, followed Peter, who used to give teaching as necessity demanded, but not making, as it were, an arrangement of the Lord's oracles, so that Mark did nothing wrong in thus writing down single points as he remembered them. Now, I've saved this little piece for today because this is exactly what we were arguing in our lecture, remember, last Monday night. This is not only what we should expect, this is the reasonable expectation that Peter would continually give out Jesus all over the place, but never in a sequence. Mark comes along and sequences it and puts it in the form of a gospel. That's the earliest tradition we have about our Gospels. 125. Now Eusebius himself, who writes 200 years later, said, "A great light of religion shone on the minds of the hearers of Peter, so that they were not satisfied with a single hearing or with the unwritten teaching of the divine proclamation, but with every kind of exhortation besought Mark, whose gospel is extant, seeing that he was Peter's follower, to leave them a written statement of the teaching given them verbally. Nor did they cease until they had persuaded him, and so became the cause of the Scripture called the Gospel according to Mark." Now that's an historian writing some 250 years later, and it's what I call that's a good historical sentence. And there's no reason to doubt the basic essence of it, but I guess I'm one of those who doubts whether Mark wrote at the persuasion of the church in Rome or whether Mark wrote out of his own urgencies for the sake of the church in Rome. In any case, both of these pieces of information, and of course Eusebius is almost certainly dependent at this point on Papias, indicate that Mark has a very close relationship with Peter, and this of course doesn't in this case locate Peter in Rome, but we'll say something about that a little later. Well, what this testimony says, 4 points: that there's a very close connection with Peter, that Mark had no first-hand knowledge, that he had no great concern with chronological order, and that what Mark picked up, he did so as Peter's, and then I left out my Greek word, hermeneutes, is Peter's interpreter. Now, the question is this reliable testimony? Now, there are some scholars who have rejected this testimony almost out of hand for 3 reasons. First of all, they argue it expresses the concern for a respectable pedigree. That is, since it came to have Mark's name attached to it, this reflects a desire to give it a higher apostolic authority. In other words, the hidden motive behind this is, since it had such a lesser figure as Mark, whose name is attached to it, this little bit of stuff is an early church's interest in attaching a higher authority to the gospel that Mark himself didn't carry. But in response to that, there is no evidence for this kind of thing as early as Papias. That is, that anybody has any interest in what I call the pedigree of an anonymous document like one of our Gospels. In fact, the statement is not of that kind at all. That is, it's not the kind of it. We've got this kind of thing at a later time. And all you have to do is look at those kind of statements and you can see all the earmarks of trying to give pedigree to something it doesn't have. But this is not one of those kinds of statements. It rather expresses a more straightforward reporting of what Papias had been able to pick up from somewhere. This is Papias' understanding of what lies behind the gospel. And that's all he's passing on. But the crucial thing, top of page 5, is the very fact that Mark's name came to be attached to the gospel at all indicates an authentic tradition. Of all the obscure people in the New Testament, who in the world would have ever chosen Mark to attach his name to this gospel? The point is, if there's anything that is as bedrock history as we've got from the early 2nd century, surely this little bit of tradition is. Who in the world would have ever dreamed up attaching an anonymous document to the name of Mark? Who doesn't come off very well, you understand, in the Acts and the Pauline letters. I mean, of all the obscure types, this is the unlikely type. The point, of course, is that his name gets attached to it because people believed he actually wrote it. Now, the second reason for doubting is that the character of the gospel, it argues, reflects divergent traditions, not simply one man's memory. That is, it doesn't reflect just the memory of Peter. And I'm quite agreed on this. That is, I'm not going to argue that everything in Mark's gospel is in fact Petrine. But what I am going to argue is that arguing that Mark has diverse traditions does not mean that the Petrine element is not a part of that. I mean, I find that kind of argumentation goes over very poorly with me, because somehow if it's not all Petrine, then it's not Petrine at all. It is the kind of argument that says if there's one thing that's not right, then it's all wrong, kind of a reverse domino theory, and I simply reject that as having anything to do with history. There are all kinds of good reasons for believing we have genuine Petrine traditions in the Gospel of Mark. On the other hand, no reason to believe that everything, in fact, actually came from Peter. That is, it could, but there's no essential reason to believe that. Well, the last one, of course, is his obvious theological concern. And it's argued that theology means, therefore, that it can't be good history, therefore it can't reflect Peter's understanding. Well, I've already spoken to that, so we'll pass on to saying some things in favor of the tradition. There does, in fact, seem to be a clear Petrine tradition found throughout the Gospel of Mark. The fact that the call of Peter coincides with the beginning of Jesus' public ministry is a very significant historical datum. You understand, there's not a hint of anything about Jesus until the very first public narrative, and that coincides with the call of Peter. It's as if the story of Jesus begins at this point. Well, the early events then all center in Peter's house or town. In 1:21 to 28, there's an exorcism in the synagogue in Capernaum. Then they move to Peter's house and the raising of his mother-in-law. And in 1:32 to 34, the healing after sundown, where the whole city is at the door. I happen to think that 2:1 to 11 originally belonged right here, because in the narrative in 2:1 to 11, you have Jesus in Capernaum, in the house, at the door, which is exactly the language that goes back to 1:32 to 34. And there's no hint at the beginning of that narrative that Jesus came back into Capernaum. But you understand that originally belonged immediately following the narrative of 32 to 34. Then you've got a collection of what I call Peter in Capernaum, a couple of days in the early memory of Peter. In 1:35 to 39, then we're told that Simon and those with him and their consternation that Jesus should leave when the revival had just begun. Well, thereafter, Peter and the rest do not always come out so well. In 4:13, they are rebuked for failure to understand the parables. 4:40, in the boat, Jesus says, "Why are you so cowardly? Do you not yet have faith?" 6:52, they did not understand about the loaves. Their hearts were hardened. 7:18, in response to their question, Jesus says, "Do you not yet understand? Are your hearts hardened?" In 8:14 to 21, the leaven of the Pharisees, they come off exceedingly dull. 3 times Jesus says, "Are your hearts hardened? Do you not yet understand?" And in 8:32, Peter began to rebuke Jesus because he said he was going to die, and Jesus in turn rebukes Peter and says, "Get behind me, Satan." Chapter 9, 5 and 6 at the Transfiguration, he ends up with egg all over his face one more time. 9:33, 34, immediately following the second passion prediction, they're disputing with one another over who's the greatest. Again, it's a Capernaum incident. 10:13, they rebuke those who bring children to Jesus. 10:28, Peter says, "We've left everything to follow you." Implied, of course, is, what do we get from all of this? 10:35 to 45, after the third passion prediction, there's internal strife over position. And then finally in 14:27 to 31, Peter's denial is foretold with Peter's own vehement denial. 14:37, Peter sleeps in Gethsemane. And then in 14:66 to 72, the denial itself, including his cursing. But note 16:7. Only in Mark's Gospel, the risen Jesus tells the women, "Go tell my disciples and Peter." Now it has been argued that Peter could scarcely be responsible for this picture. That is, how could one portray himself so? Well, my response to that, and that is a position taken by a large number of scholars. It just sort of says, these cannot be genuine Petrine traditions because a genuine apostle wouldn't have portrayed himself in this way. And I asked myself, have you ever read Paul? Note how often Paul remembers, and how he remembers himself as one who is a blasphemer, injurious. I mean, he uses the strongest kind of language for his own pre-Christian life. How is it that Paul can remember himself before Christ in this way, but Peter is not allowed to? And besides, if we want to ask rhetorical questions, let me try this one on you. Who else in the early church could possibly have gotten away with this, given Peter's position? That is, who except somebody who was Peter's enemy, and we don't know of Peter having any enemies, who could have possibly portrayed Peter except Peter himself in this way? Now, my point, of course, is that remarkable understanding of your life before and after when you've had a genuine encounter of grace with the risen Christ. And so Peter can paint the picture vividly and truly because he knows before and after, and knows that Jesus was gracious to him even when he was dull of hearing and simply not cluing in to what was going on. Well, this relationship seems also to be the best explanation for other characteristics of Mark's presentation. The vigor of the language and style, including the Semitisms. Mark's narrative is the narrative of somebody who is writing down the oral telling of the story. The clearest evidence of these are these 151 historical presents. If you've ever heard a good storyteller with children, rarely do they ever tell the story in the past tense. They tell it in the present tense. And it's in the telling of the story in the present tense that the audience is always a part of the narrative. That is the mark of superb narration. And Mark simply keeps that. He keeps the tradition alive in the present tense. And Luke and Matthew obliterate every single one of these because they are now writing literature. When you start writing literature, it now becomes past tense. In Mark's narration, it's, and then he does this, and then he does this, and the next thing he does this, and that accounts for the next thing, this thing called parataxis in Greek that's called and. You ever heard a good storyteller? And the next thing, and then. Well, that's also very Semitic. But that's because in the Hebrew, because Hebrew was first of all an oral culture before it was a written culture. And you just simply have this continuous vav that just goes all the way, everywhere. Kai on Greek. And. Just you look it up sometime in the King James Version, and 99% of the verses in Mark's Gospel start with the word and. It's just the mark of what I call the narrative still being a living thing. Well, Semitism. Jesus answered, saying. The only person who would ever speak like that is somebody that had been well trained in reading their Bible or themselves Hebrew. I mean, that is about as non-Greek as anything could ever happen on the face of the earth. Somebody answered, saying. But your Old Testament is just full of that. It's a Septuagintalism that just found everywhere in Mark. Well, he also likes this little Caiaphas. And immediately, 41 times. Now, don't look for them in your NIV, because the NIV, there are 10 of them in chapter 1. That is, 10 Caiaphas in chapter 1, only 2 of which have been maintained in the NIV. I sympathize on the one hand for the readability of the NIV, but I always wince when I realize the kind of thing Mark's doing. But of course, part of the problem is that sometimes and immediately doesn't mean and immediately. Even the King James Version recognized that, and they translated it with this and anon, or and straightway, but and anon, A-N-O-N. You know what that word means? Well, it means and then next, or something like that. It's just a kind of a non-word, because Caiaphas doesn't always mean and immediately. And immediately he went into the synagogue on the Sabbath. And immediately there was a man with an unclean spirit. And immediately Jesus said to him, this sort of thing. This just, Mark's narrative just full of this type of thing. Well, the last one is that Semitism will not belabor. The fact that Jesus' words are remembered in their Aramaic original. Now, I don't know how many of you are from ethnic traditions, and you're either children or grandchildren of people who are not native North Americans, native English speakers. They're ethnic of some sort. In my case, it's Swedish. The stories that get told in our home, you understand, always drop a Swedish word here and there. Because there's something about telling the story with one of the words from the homeland that tell the story better. Now, you certainly have a tradition like that. I mean, just where no matter, after about 4 or 5 generations, that all gets lost. On my father's side, none of that. The Germanic part goes back too far, but the Swedish is still happens with my father-in-law, he's the second generation. His parents came from Sweden. And we still catch the Swedish word now and then. Because there's something about saying it in the mother tongue that the second language, even if it's your first language, never quite captures. Well, that's exactly what's going on in Mark's Gospel. In the telling of the story, some of the Aramaic words just stay with the story. Boanerges, sons of thunder. You don't know whether that's altogether a flattering epithet or not. Jesus tells a young woman, Talitha cum, and the very words of Jesus are remembered. Korban, Ephatha, so forth. Well, then there are those special touches of what appear to be vivid recollection. 133, the whole city is gathered at the door. 2:4, they tore up the roof, having dug it up. The kind of thing you'd remember if it's your house, you understand, and somebody's being dropped in your, you know what I mean? And all you have to do is look at Matthew and Luke's version, and that's the stuff that gets left out, because it's quite irrelevant to the story. But it's not irrelevant to Peter's memory of telling the story. He's sitting in his home, and all of a sudden, and here his home is no longer capable of holding out the occasional rains. We read past those kind of things too quickly. Well, there's a lot of them. Jesus sleeping on a cushion in the stern. When you're about to go over, this is the kind of thing that, first of all, would be unlikely for an imagination to create, but it's the very kind of thing that if you were in the boat and you remembered it, that's what you'd remember. Asleep on a pillow in the stern while the rest of us are going to sink. That's memory. Well, all of these together indicate close links to the oral tradition and the memory of an eyewitness. Now, one final note about the Petrine relationship. In 1 Peter 5:13, first epistle of Peter says, "She who is elect in Babylon, and Mark my son, send greetings." Now that little sentence places Peter and Mark together in Rome. There are several other things that support a Roman provenance for this gospel. In Mark 15:21, Mark tells us, and this is one of those little pieces of information that are so irrelevant to the story unless the people for whom the story is intended have vested interests in this. We're told that Simon of the Cyrene, the father of Alexander and Rufus. Now, who in the world could care that Simon was the father of Alexander and Rufus? Well, in Romans 16:13, Paul himself, speaking of a Roman Christian, says, "Greet Rufus, elect in the Lord, and his mother and mine." Rufus, earlier, because he has a relationship. He doesn't know the church in Rome because he's never been there. But he knows Rufus, and he knows Rufus' mother well enough to call Rufus' mother his own mother. And here is a Roman Christian who lives in Rome, and 8 years later, Gospel of Mark appears in the same area, and we're told that the one who carried Jesus' cross is none other than the father of Alexander and Rufus. Can't prove that's the Rufus, but that certainly makes an awful lot of sense of that little Alexander and Rufus thing in Mark's Gospel. The final thing we'll not bore you with, it's simply the Latinisms. Mark regularly uses a Latin expression when there's a perfectly good Greek one that would suffice. And he'll use the Latin expression which indicates that he's using the Latin version of Greek, as it were. The giveaway on this is the one in 1539, the last one, where he calls this man a centurion. The Greek word for this is hekaton tarkes. Hekaton is the word for 100, and arches means the leader. So the leader of 100. And the centurion is exactly what that is translated, you understand, into Latin, but now transliterated from Latin into Greek. So you've got a thoroughly Latin word transliterated into Greek, and it's the word Mark uses, and when Matthew and Luke come along, they simply switch it back into its Greek because they have no vested Roman interests in this kind of language. Well, to conclude, all of this is not to say that everything came from Peter. That's much too narrow a view of Mark, who after all was more often a companion of Paul than he was of Peter. And secondly, there's so much in the gospel that is untouched by much of this. But it is to say that the pericopes, by and large, bear the stamp of an authentic recounting. However, confidence in the details is not the same as confidence in the big picture, so we need to spend a little time on this particular question. The Markan framework, question that's been much debated, and I've got a bit of a brief bibliography in that note. The reason for this debate and the questioning of Mark's framework, of course, goes back to form criticism and the fact that the pericopes were independent or tended to, and even as Papias says, Peter just told the stories as they fitted the occasion, and Mark is the one that comes along. So with Papias himself suggesting as much, and then form criticism analyzing the data, it is argued that the framework there's much reason for doubt. And it's in this case then that the tide of Peter does have some relevance, because you understand that the framework at least can be tied back to Peter himself. Well, my point finally is that the Markan framework makes such good sense of the real question, why did Jesus die by crucifixion? You understand, that's the real question that one has to always ask in a life of Jesus. Why did he die by crucifixion? There's absolutely no good historical reason for it under any ordinary look at history. I mean, you and I are so used to it, and we think theologically, of course it had to happen because God foreordained that it had to happen. But when you think of it just historically, there's absolutely no good historical reason for Jesus to have died by crucifixion. The question is, why did he? And Mark's framework gives us the best possible historical answer to that question. Now, let's note the framework. We'll examine some of the details later when we actually look at the early ministry of Jesus, because I'm convinced this is the historical framework. First, he gives us the picture of an early ministry as an itinerant in Galilee. He heals and teaches in Galilee. The synagogue is the base of operation. He gathered about him some very close followers, and very soon he had tremendous notoriety. Now, you don't have any difficulty recognizing that part of the framework. But what you might not recognize is that Mark paints this picture in our chapter 1 on the basis of 4 narratives. And he does it with consummate skill. You talk about skill in composition. That you are so comfortable with that framework. It's the dead giveaway that Mark did his work so well. And he did that in 1 chapter with just 4 narratives. Get to the end of chapter 1, you feel like you've been with Jesus just sort of for weeks, catching your breath. He just, striding through Galilee with this great ministry. That's the start. Well, the second thing that Mark tells us in the framework is that this great notoriety brings opposition. There are a variety of reasons for it, but mostly because he does so many things wrong, and religiously wrong, politically wrong. Yet he has such tremendous popularity, and so you can already see the tensions that are at work. Jesus has tremendous popularity with the crowds, but it's a popularity that is a kind of, that surrounds an iconoclast. That surrounds this type that doesn't do things right. And the religious and the authorities want the popular people always to conform. Here's one who obviously doesn't conform. And yet the crowds just won't quit. And so there's this tremendous opposition. That picture is painted in 2:1 to 3:6. All you have to do is look at 3:6, 3, 5, and 6, and you can see that opposition makes strange bedfellows. Herodians and Pharisees now are planning together what they can do about Jesus. And this is early on in the ministry, Mark tells us, and there's no reason to doubt that. I mean, all the right reasons for believing this. Because all you have to do is think your way through what happens to the nonconformist type who has immense popularity with the crowds and who obviously has some power. I mean, he's healing the sick and casting out demons and all kinds of stuff make people nervous. And especially the people who are in charge. And you understand, there's always some stuff going on by the people who are in charge, because on the one hand, anybody that doesn't come from their circle who has this kind of popularity is a threat just by the nature of things. But the other side of it is that they're in charge because the Romans have given them the right to be in charge. And there's always the threat that Rome, that an upstart like this will in fact create real trouble. And then Rome will descend and the whole thing is up for grabs. So you understand the reason for the smoke-filled rooms, if I may use the political imagery of what's going on in 3:6. The reason for the smoke-filled rooms is plenty good and very early and plenty of talk. Who is this guy? What did he do? And what are we going to do? What's going on? Now, what this means, of course, is the next step, Mark tells us, is that Jesus withdraws from the synagogue altogether. And he goes to the sea. And there he teaches people out in the open, draws huge crowds. Then we're told that popularity and opposition run parallel until he sends out the 12, and then everything is running along in the same vein until the feeding of the 5,000. And that obviously is a climax of some kind, and surely the climax of Jesus' popularity in Galilee. So the next thing Mark tells us is a withdrawal from Galilee. This is followed by a long section in which Jesus gives private instructions to his disciples. And in this private instruction, he predicts his death, sees it as redemptive in some way. And then we're told that he takes a trip to Jerusalem where there's an open encounter, there are open controversies, and then he cleanses the temple as a prophetic action, and in doing so crosses the wrong crowd. And that leads to his arrest, and finally to his being tried, turned over to the Roman authorities where he's crucified, and that is followed by the news of a resurrection. Now that's the Markan framework. That's the story as you know it. As it's, maybe you don't know it. I mean, maybe you've had so many Sunday school stories that you don't know the framework of the story. But that's the Markan framework, and that's the framework that probably the vast majority of any attempts to do a life of Jesus will tend to follow. Now, the basic reasons for doubting the framework, besides the skepticism that arises from some form-critical presuppositions, is that within that framework there are such clear theological concerns that stand out. And of course, hidden in that kind of objection is you can't have history and theology both. The theology means you're bending history to serve your purposes. Well, the theological concerns are twofold: the nature of Jesus' messiahship and the role of the disciples. And there's an enormous literature on these two subjects, on Markan theology. Well, let's conclude with a few words about the Markan theology, because I happen to think that not only is his history good, but his theology is what makes sense of the history and makes sense of Jesus. There's a kind of a preview, if you will, then of the whole course, but we'll pick it up again in detail as we go along. Let's begin with his concern over the nature of Jesus' messiahship. And there are three things that emerge in Mark's telling of the story. The first is that Jesus is the Son of God and the Messiah. Put those in reverse order. He's the Messiah and the Son of God. Secondly, that Jesus is God's suffering servant. And third, that Jesus keeps His identity secret. Now that's the part you can't have missed. If you've read Mark's Gospel, you can't have missed this continuing motif of what we call the Messianic secret. Don't tell anyone, don't tell anyone. He wouldn't let His disciples tell anyone. Those that He heals, He won't let tell anyone. He just simply keeps His identity secret. Now, Mark weaves these three together. The dual Son of God, suffering servant roles, plus the role of the disciples, as dull of understanding when they are let in on the secret, has led to some extreme positions. And here I'm not going to go through these because these are simply attempts to try to make sense of Mark's creativity. Let me turn the page and suggest that we can probably do better by allowing certain things, if we allow certain things to be historical. First, let's begin with what seems to me good bedrock history. And there seems to be no reason to doubt it. I put in parentheses, what else might one expect historically? And that is that the disciples have a truly Jewish messianic outlook. What else would you expect? But that's the first point. Just make that point and stick that away for a moment. Then secondly, allow that Jesus fits and doesn't fit those Jewish messianic expectations. That is, there are those ways that He does, and then there are those ways that He doesn't. So that they're always sort of left guessing, as it were, about Jesus because of the ambiguity they experience with regard to their own expectations. What you have then, and allow this now as a third thing which Mark presents, that there is a tentative recognition by the disciples. Now you understand the significance of the Caesarea Philippi narrative. Jesus finally has the disciples all by themselves, completely in a foreign country, and He says, okay, who do people say that I am? A prophetic figure, right down the line, a prophetic figure. Well, who do you say that I am? Peter, speaking for the crowd, says, we've got it, you're the Messiah. And Jesus says, okay, don't tell anyone. I'm going to go to Jerusalem, and I'm going to fall afoul of the authorities, and they're going to crucify me. And I'm going to be raised. And what's Peter's next response? No way, Jose. Not possible. Now, do you understand? He can't fit his own understanding of what a Messiah ought to be like with Jesus accepting that He is what Peter has said, the Messiah, and the fact that the Messiah is going to die. There is no way they can fit that in. Just allow that that's good bedrock history. And what else would you expect? Then allow further that there's outright recognition by the demons, of course. They recognize Him not as Jesus of Nazareth, but as the Holy One of God. And so they're silenced every single instance. And of course, you say, well, if the demons are going around shouting about who He is, then why don't the people recognize Him? And the answer is because it's demons. Demons shout all kinds of weird and crazy things. Jesus silences them. Well, then allow the final thing, that to the crowds, He fits every possible expression of understanding what the return of prophecy is going to be like, the return of a prophet. He's the prophet from Nazareth, the prophet from Nazareth to the crowds. Now just allow that those three things make good sense historically, and there's no reason to doubt that. And then finally, that Jesus Himself knew all along. And at least from His baptism on, knew very clearly what it was all about. Just allow that, and you can make everything fall into place. He disallows the demons to speak because they recognize Him. He forbids making too much of His miracles precisely because they would lead to incorrect messianic fervor. He doesn't want the crowds to hail Him as Messiah, precisely because they'll get in the way of His messianic destiny. And finally, He reveals to the disciples little by little, but like the blind man. Notice how Mark has constructed that narrative. They're on a ship crossing the sea, a boat crossing the sea again. They've not brought any bread. And Jesus says, beware the leaven of the Pharisees. And they start grumbling because they've not brought any bread. Jesus said, are you so dull? Do you not understand? Are your hearts hardened? Don't you understand? Don't you understand? Don't you understand? Well, obviously they don't understand. He gets off the boat and He heals a blind man. But the first touch is a blind man who says, I see, but I see men like trees walking. He touches them a second time and they see everything clearly. And then He takes them to Caesarea Philippi and says, who am I? And they say, you're the Messiah. And Jesus says, you got it. Now I'm going to go die. He said, no way. And Jesus says, get behind me, Satan, because you still have to have that next touch. It takes the resurrection for them to finally get clued in. And there's no sense saying, well, Jesus predicted His resurrection, because how can you hear a resurrection prediction when you can't even handle the fact that the Messiah is going to die? I mean, if you've ever heard an unimaginable thing in your life, it's the idea that the Messiah is going to die. That's not what you have Messiahs for. Okay? Now, my point is that all of that makes absolutely good historical sense. And that is Mark's story. Why Mark's retelling, especially with his emphasis that the Son of God is also God's suffering servant? Well, precisely because the suffering of the church at Rome, undergoing a pogrom, if you will, under Nero. And so what Mark's concern is with the true nature of discipleship. The first instruction on discipleship does not occur in Mark's Gospel until 834, after Jesus announces He's going to go to Jerusalem and die. And the first word in discipleship in Mark's Gospel, if anybody will come after me, let him take a cross and follow me. Mark's point, of course, is it is the way the Master went. Should not the servant tread it still? This, of course, is quite in keeping with Pauline theology, Petrine theology. It is, in fact, thoroughgoing in the New Testament. It is also the faith of the early church in a much broader scale, as I point out in the final page. Hence, I think it is historically arguable that the Markan framework does, in fact, go back to bedrock history and does, in fact, give us a viable framework within which to try to understand Jesus. And so that is exactly what we're going to try to do in this class, is understand Jesus, assuming the Markan framework to be the historical framework within which we can make things fit. Well, before we take our break, let me just very quickly thumb through the Matthean material. I want to say just a word about authorship, because here's a case where I think the tradition probably has it wrong. There are a number of difficulties with Matthean authorship of the gospel that bears his name. And the reason for it is, in this case, the tradition has some very real problems with it. The tradition in this case also comes from Papias, and therefore is very early. But Papias also tells us that Matthew's gospel was written first, and that it was originally written in Hebrew or Aramaic. Now, the latter thing is almost impossible. It is simply not the Greek of translation. It is the Greek of somebody who wrote Greek well and knew Greek as a first language. This is not translation Greek, whatever else it is. It is that little piece in the puzzle that sort of screws up the tradition at this point. And almost certainly he's not the first gospel, although by the time of Papias it may have been believed that he was. Now, the problem here is large, because the question still remains, why does Matthew's name get attached to this gospel? And so I suggest to you that the tradition is much too strong to believe that Matthew did not write something. And probably what he wrote has some connection with our first gospel. That is, I'm quite convinced that the tradition is correct in that Matthew wrote something very early, and he wrote it in Aramaic or Hebrew, and that what he wrote ended up becoming a part of our gospel. And it's because of that that Matthew's name becomes attached to the gospel that we have. But it's very unlikely that Matthew himself is responsible for the gospel that bears his name, probably because it would have been written a little too late for Matthew to have written it, and probably because it's just a little too good for somebody for whom at best Greek would be a second language. So here is a place where we can have very little confidence that we are dealing with the work of an eyewitness, although there's no reason to doubt again that because of the Matthean traditions, whatever they are, maybe Matthew... The thing that Papias says, by the way, is that Matthew wrote the sayings of Jesus, the logia of Jesus. That's the Greek word, logia. That looks very much like what we've called Q. And it very well may be that something like what we know as Q, did have documentary existence early on, and the Matthew was responsible for it. I can't prove that, but I'm not willing to give up the tradition because it's too early, and it's the kind of tradition that seems to have... That is, why would anybody choose Matthew's name if Matthew himself did not have something to do with the gospel that bore his name? So probably there's some connection. It's just that I don't think we'll ever know what it is. Now, just a couple of quick words about what he does with Mark, the double tradition, and M. That is, now I'm talking about the gospel we now have, and we'll call it Matthew's gospel, of course, because that's the way it's known to us. First of all, his use of Mark. He includes most of Mark's material, and I've given you the 7 exceptions. These are just 7 short pericopes that are omitted. The second thing to note is that he follows Mark's order very closely. Beginning at Mark 6:17, which is paralleled in Matthew 14:1, there is from that point on not a single pericope out of Mark's order. That is, from Mark 6:17 all the way through the rest of Mark's gospel, there is nothing that Matthew has that does not follow Mark's order absolutely one for one. Now, in the earlier chapters, there are only 4 pericopes that are in a different order, and I've given these here, and you can look those up for yourself sometime and see if you can't make some guesses as to why Matthew might have done that. The third thing to note is that Matthew condenses Mark's narrative 25 to 50%. That is, if Mark tells the story in 200 words, Matthew will consistently tell the story between 100 and 150, consistently. But interestingly, he keeps 70% of Mark's words of what he retains. So he omits 25 to 50% of Mark, but what he keeps, he tends to keep Mark's words very, very closely. When we come to Luke, you'll see how different it is for what Luke does when he uses Mark's gospel. Now, the basic differences with Mark, and this is what, of course, makes Matthew's gospel not only the first gospel in the canon, but the first gospel in the church's tradition. I don't know if you recognize that or not, but the church has always considered Matthew's gospel the first gospel. And I don't mean by that first in the canon. I mean, this is the one that is the starting point for the church's understanding of Jesus. Good reasons for this, because Matthew gives us a much more systematic arrangement of the whole story. In fact, as I point out in my survey class, the skill of Matthew's gospel lies in the fact that on the one hand, he so clearly systematizes the story. And on the other hand, he keeps the narrative going so you can't miss the Markan narrative. So you never lose sense that you've lost the narrative of Mark, but then he has these marvelous ways of systematizing the material. And he does this basically by his insertions of large blocks of material. He begins, of course, with chapters 1 and 2, the birth narratives. The rest of these are all teaching materials. Cue materials, basically. The Sermon on the Mount, the mission words of Jesus, plus the John the Baptist and Woe sayings, 4 new parables of the kingdom, church instructions, and then finally chapters 23 to 25, the woes on the Pharisees and some additional eschatological parables. And all of these are very systematically arranged. And in fact, in each case, they conclude with a formula that goes something like this. And when Jesus had finished all of these sayings, and then he goes back to the Markan narrative. So 5 times in Matthew's Gospel, and when Jesus had finished, and then he starts up the narrative again. And it's clear that that's his way of, we're leaving the teaching now and going back to the narrative. So when Jesus had finished all these sayings, we're back to the story. Now, Matthew's redactional interests, I've simply given here. And I'm not going to go over any of that because that says more about Matthew than it does about our interest in the story of Jesus itself. The one thing to point out is that Matthew certainly does have, for want of a better term, a heightened Christology. Very keen kind of thing that he does with the Markan narrative over and over again, where Jesus, whenever in Mark's Gospel Jesus asks a question, those are all removed in Matthew's retelling. And Jesus just speaks, knowing who has touched him and that type of thing. And he does this with such consistency that it's pretty clear we're dealing with a more reflective Christological understanding in terms of who Jesus is and especially the concerns that Matthew has in his telling of the story. Okay, let's take our break at this point. We'll come back and do the same thing with Luke. You do appreciate that the Gospels themselves are anonymous. They're anonymous in this sense, that we don't know who wrote them. There's nothing inside the Gospels that says who wrote them. You understand? They come to us unknown to us. Now, they were not anonymous to the people who first received them. You appreciate that the people in Rome knew that Mark had done Mark's Gospel, okay? So it's not anonymous in that sense. But the fact that he doesn't signature his Gospel is also followed by Luke and Matthew. And that interests me. I don't know why they should not put their names on what they've written, but it also probably says something about their sense of insignificance with regard to the story. I think Mark actually puts himself in his story. There's this intriguing little 2 verses in chapter 14 where Jesus is arrested in Gethsemane, and there's this young man who is following at a distance, and they grab his linen cloak and he runs away naked. Since Mark lived in Jerusalem, that is almost certainly Mark's little signature saying, I was there too, in this circuitous way. And the reason for it is that it absolutely interrupts the narrative. I mean, here we are in the narrative of the single most significant event in human history. And it's like somebody says, and Mr. Smith dropped his pocket handkerchief. You know what I mean? So anyway, I happen to believe that, but that's totally non-provable. Yeah, I don't think he had first-hand knowledge. I mean, he's there only in a most distant sense in that last event. No suggestion that he's a disciple or anything else. He was there because he probably had some insider information and knew something was going to happen on that hill that night, and he went out to find out and got himself into trouble and was quite glad to leave his cloak in their hands and get away, in his skinnies. He was glad to be home. So anyway, I don't know. But the point is, it's not a matter of faith. We have nothing internal to go on at all. It is purely a matter of believing the tradition or not believing the tradition, and I've tried to give you good reasons for believing the tradition in both cases, except to indicate in case of Matthew there's some very difficult things within the tradition which suggest that in its present form, probably not the Matthew whom we know in the Gospel itself. Now Luke. As with Matthew, our primary interest in this course is with Luke's redaction of the material. First, a word about authorship, and then just a few words about how he handles the materials. As with Mark, but in contrast to Matthew, the evidence that Luke wrote the gospel that bears his name is really very good. It is a matter of some converging evidence. There's no question that the same person authored both Luke and Acts. In Acts, certain passages emerge that are called the we passages that indicate the author was an occasional traveling companion of Paul's. There's evidence that left him in Philippi for an extended period. It becomes very important to my reconstructing some things in the Pauline letters. Luke probably led the church in Philippi for a 3-year period. In any case, the possible options narrow down to 3 or 4, including Luke, and it's at this point that the tradition takes over, and it is the unanimous tradition of the church in the 2nd century that Luke wrote Luke Acts, that is the Gospel and the book of Acts that bear his name. About him personally, there are 3 explicit references in the New Testament, all in the Pauline letters. He is probably the unnamed brother in 2 Corinthians 8:18. We are ascending along with Titus, the brother who is praised by all the churches for his service to the gospel, since according to Acts, Luke is in Macedonia at this time. The tradition about Luke has 2 things in it which are very important to my understanding of Luke and Acts. And I take this tradition. This says something about my approach to all of our historical sources. Let's take them seriously until something internally just indicates that it doesn't work. And that's why I finally opt out of the Matthean authorship of Matthew, because there's some very difficult matters that face us in that one. Let's assume the tradition to have reasons for being that exist right back in good history. That first of all, he's a Gentile, and secondly, a native of Antioch. If you allow the tradition at this point to be historical, it makes sense of every last thing in the Gospel and the book of Acts. It says something about the reason for his special knowledge of the church in Antioch, his being a travel companion of Paul. Therefore he knows that's why he became a travel companion of Paul. And he didn't become so until he himself had moved from Antioch to Troas. And that explains why somebody all of a sudden in Troas would just join the party and start talking, we did this and we did that and we did something else, because he had known Paul earlier as a very close friend and brother in that church. The fact that special knowledge of Antioch ceases after Luke leaves Antioch, his special knowledge of Herodian affairs that emerge in the Gospel. One of the brothers in Antioch is a man named Manaen, who was formerly of the court of Herod. So here you have a connection to all of the Herodian stuff that occurs, and occurs only in Luke's Gospel. It's unique to Luke's Gospel. And then, of course, his special interest in Barnabas, book of Acts, who was also a long-time resident leader of the church in Antioch. This also suggests that he's not too far away from what we call, in my earlier days, Palestine or present-day Israel. And he was a part of the entourage when Paul was arrested in Jerusalem, in his final arrest in Jerusalem. He was in Caesarea when Paul was there for 2 years in an imprisonment. And there's every good reason to think that his interest in the story, he used the 2 years to gather as much as he could. I've been the perfect time historically. When I say things like this, interestingly, the scholarly community just winces because it's too neat, it's too easy. But the fact is that real people are doing these things, and real people who have done just exactly something like this. It just never seems to me to be a reason for doubt, when in fact we're dealing with real human beings, and this is what real human beings do. He's with Paul during that 2-year imprisonment in Caesarea. Here is probably where he gets information from Mary herself. This is where he would have taken time to do that kind of thing. And he does tell us, he starts his gospel, having had good information from the very beginning. Not meaning he was a part of the beginning, but from those who go back to the very beginning. So no reason to doubt Luke's authorship, and also then to note that the significance for the history. Excuse me a moment. Well, I would like to make one further note, and that's the correspondences with Paul are remarkable. One of the places where Luke very decidedly differs from Mark, Matthew is the institution of the Lord's Supper. And in fact, he agrees more carefully or more closely with the Pauline tradition. And you understand, Paul antedates, Paul in 1 Corinthians 11 is earlier than all of our Gospels. So we're talking about something that's at least 10 or 12 years earlier than Mark. And Luke's presentation of the institution of the Lord's Supper is closer to Paul's than Matthew's is to Mark's. What we're dealing with is the Lord's Supper tradition in the Pauline churches. And when Luke comes to it, he uses the Lord's Supper tradition in the church that he knows. So again, the relationship with Paul and the fact that we have this very close tie with Paul. When Paul cites the gospel, he does so in the Lucan version. That probably says, that's of course an anachronism. That's an anachronistic way of saying it. You understand? What Luke has are the Jesus materials as they live in the Pauline churches. That's the other way of putting it, which is the better way to speak of it historically. Well, all of this to say further, for sure we have no eyewitness. Nonetheless, he claims to have heard from eyewitnesses and to have studied the materials closely. And in his case, he knows of prior attempts to do what he sets out to do. So it should not be surprising that we think of Luke's using Mark's gospel. He actually tells us he knows of such. Now, some words about his use of Mark and Q and L materials. First of all, his use of Mark. He uses less of Mark than does Matthew. He omits several things. Recognize there's one piece there, the third one, 6:45 to 8:26, that is a considerable block of material. That's not a pericope. That is an extended piece of material. It happens to be the entire block of non-Galilean material. Luke simply leaves it out. Jesus never leaves Galilee in Luke's gospel until he goes to Jerusalem to die. And so that, I don't know if that accounts for it. At least by not having that material in there, it at least leaves Luke's gospel with Jesus without ever leaving Galilee. Well, there are some other items. When he does use Mark, he tends to follow Mark's sequence rather closely. There are the 4 exceptions. And then there are several items in the Passion narrative. And Luke's Passion narrative, therefore, is one of the intriguing moments in gospel study because he obviously knows Mark's Passion narrative, but he's on his own in his Passion narrative. It's not clear at all yet what, in fact, he is doing and where he gets his particular expression of it. Well, in any case, except for the business of the appointing of the 12, he seems in each case to be following a different tradition. That is, when he doesn't follow Mark's sequence, he also follows the Q tradition of the same material. So, in some ways, these are all Markan omissions as well. And then when he has that material, he has a different version of it, what we call the Q version. That is inserted and almost certainly comes from the Q source that he has in common with Matthew. Now, he includes more of Mark's details than does Matthew, but fewer of Mark's actual words. So he tends to have more of the actual material, but fewer of Mark's actual words. To put it another way, he tends to keep Mark about 75 to 80% of what Mark writes. But when he does it, he rewrites it considerably in his own words. So it's clearly the Markan stuff, but now in a Lucan dress. So that he actually averages at about 40% of Mark's words. And remember, Matthew is somewhere at 70%. So even though he has more of Mark, he has fewer of Mark's words. Now, in contrast to Matthew, talk about two totally different ways of using their same basic source. Matthew, remember, just tends to just follow Mark and then just inserts. Or inserts, but he inserts by adding, or what I call expanding the material. That is, Mark has 3 parables of the kingdom. Well, 4 parables of the kingdom. Matthew leaves one of those out and adds 4 of his own. Jesus has some woes of the Pharisees, and Matthew has more woes of the Pharisees. Jesus has some eschatological parables. Matthew has more eschatological parables. In other words, he just expands the stuff that's there and then inserts these large blocks of material. Well, Luke rarely expands. What he does is he inserts whole blocks of material, just like whole, just, you see him, just stuck in there. In fact, you can simply take Luke's gospel apart and divide it into Mark and L plus Q material woven together into a block. Mark, L plus Q. Mark, L plus Q. And this is so neat that when you take Luke's gospel apart and see that that's what he's done, there are a number of scholars who think that what Luke did was actually to write this L plus Q stuff plus his passion narrative first. And then he had access to Mark's gospel and rewrote the whole, and rewrote it using Mark's framework, and then just inserted this earlier stuff. It's called Proto-Luke, or the theory of a Proto-Luke. I'm very open to it. It's the kind of thing that makes sense of the data. It's, again, one of these hypotheses that can never be finally proven. But at least that would explain how he went about doing what he does. Now, besides the long omission, that's 6:45 to 8:26, he has a particularly long insertion. Almost one half of his gospel is this non-Markan stuff from 951 to 1814, in which there is no Markan material except where the traditions overlap, and he's not using Mark, he's using the other tradition. Now, in terms of his redactional concerns, I don't want to spend much time with that, but I do want to say a little bit about this fascinating middle section, which is in the middle of page 5. In 951, in Mark's narrative, Jesus sets his face to go to Jerusalem. Now, do you understand that this is the beginning of the Passion narrative in Mark's Gospel? This is at 951, 1/3 of the way into Luke's Gospel. It says Jesus set his face to go to Jerusalem. Well, it only takes 2 days to go to Jerusalem. And I don't mean by going through Samaria. I mean going the long route. He set his face to go to Jerusalem. But it takes him quite a while to get there. And you'll notice that we never lose the thread of his going to Jerusalem. And I've got them listed here. 951, 957, 1038, 1322. All of these that indicate that he's on the road. He's traveling. He's on his way to Jerusalem. This is what we call that's why this central section is sometimes called Luke's travel narrative. Because Jesus is always on his way to Jerusalem. Yet despite that clear setting, the rest of the material, it's all but lost sight of. So here you have this 2-day journey to Jerusalem, and you've got him sending out 72 others in every town. He goes through towns of Samaria. He turns to his disciples on another occasion. It's a law. When Jesus is praying in a certain place, the crowds are amazed. A woman in the crowds increase. A Pharisee invites him to eat. There are 2 Sabbaths in this material. There are all kinds of stuff. It's obviously a collection of stuff, in effect, that Luke didn't know what to do with, and it just here. But there's an awful lot of literature that's been written on this large central section. Are we to understand it in light of what's to happen in Jerusalem? And the answer probably is yes. That is, that the reason for the insertion is that all of this material eventually is to be understood in light of the fact that Jesus has set his face to go to Jerusalem, and he's going to Jerusalem to die. And here you have all of this material on true discipleship in light of what's to take place. That's the best guess that scholars have made, but it is one of the fascinating features of Luke's Gospel. Well, the only final thing to note is that Luke's interest is thoroughly soteriological. His interest is in Jesus, is primarily in what Jesus has done. for the lost. Salvation is his concern from beginning to end. And of course, this makes his gospel one of the great documents of the Christian faith, because his inclusions in the gospel in particular, the universalization of the gospel that goes in what we call the horizontal, it goes in the vertical. And every kind of people who would come under the category of the poor, the outcasts, the disenfranchised. Luke has special interests. So it's in Luke's gospel we have all of this material on the lost, the poor, and the lowly. The Samaritans, women, Gentiles come into special concern. And all of this is related to Luke's primary interest in Jesus that is announced by Simeon himself. A light for salvation to the Gentiles. Revelation to Israel and salvation to the Gentiles. You read Luke, Acts together and you can't miss that everything is shaped to this concern. What is of special concern for us in this class is that because of this unique concern, my survey class, what I call the underdog, every imaginable disenfranchised part of the human race, Luke includes at least 2 or more narratives that include them in the Jesus story. It's as if to say, just don't remember that if you're going to talk about Jesus, Jesus is the one who said at the beginning of his ministry, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, and he has anointed me to preach good news to the poor." And he never lets you forget it. All the way through the gospel, there's this thoroughgoing interest. And because of that, we are the richer. When you think of the stuff that is unique to Luke's gospel, and nearly 50% of his gospel is unique to Luke. And most of it is just filled with this stuff that, from my point of view, the Lord knows we could have never done without. It's just the stuff that fills out the picture that Mark and Matthew have, but not in this full-blown picture. So it's with great gratitude that we're blessed by Luke's presentation. Of course, because he's a Gentile himself, that's where part of his interest in this comes. And of course, as a Gentile who's heard the good news, he's full of prayer and praise and singing and joy, and so you got songs and rejoicing. Well, it's all in the notes, but you can't miss Luke's special interest. Let's turn now to the Gospel according to John. To this point, as you well know and don't need me to say, but I will, we have been investigating the sources for reconstructing the life of Jesus, and John has obviously been getting short shrift for some obvious reasons. First, because the other 3 are clearly interrelated in a way that John is not, so he had to deal with them first. Thus, we have spent considerable time analyzing the synoptic tradition before looking at John. But my problem now is that there is so much that one might say about John. What do we do in a course like this that has relevance to our interests, namely the life of Jesus? So what we're going to do is look at 4 interrelated items, and hopefully in this next hour bring John now into purview in what we're going to do in this course. The authorship. The tradition in this case is very closely related to a figure who emerges in 1323, an unnamed disciple who is always referred to as the disciple whom Jesus loved. I've given the various references. I note simply finally in 21:24 that he is singled out as the witness who wrote these things. That's said in the third person. He's the witness who wrote these things. Now, internal hints are not very many. It is curious that John is not mentioned by name in the Gospel. That may, in fact, be one of the indications of authorship. In any case, the passage in 21:2 names, and the reason for going to 21:2, of course, is at the end of this chapter, it's this one that's called whom Jesus loved, who is designated as the one who is responsible for writing these things. Well, he names Simon Peter, Thomas, Nathanael, each of whom does play a significant role in the gospel. Then the two sons of Zebedee, who are otherwise unmentioned, and then two other disciples. So we've got 4 unnamed disciples. And there is no question that the disciple whom Jesus loved is intended to be one of those 4. Now, the tradition picks it up at this point, a tradition that goes back to Irenaeus. Now, Irenaeus comes from the end of the 2nd century. But Irenaeus claims to have been a disciple of Polycarp, whom, he says, heard John. Now, what that means then is that John, as a very aged man, would have been the mentor, the teacher of Polycarp, who became Bishop of Smyrna, and whose martyrdom is a part of our treasures of early Christian literature in the 2nd century, early 2nd century. I think he was martyred around 135. And Irenaeus claims to have been a disciple of Polycarp who, he says, heard John. So it's not bad tradition. Even though it's later, it's tradition that has a very careful and close connection. It was believed, therefore, on the basis of this tradition from Irenaeus, that the gospel was the contemplative work of an eyewitness. Clement of Alexandria, at the end of the 2nd century, says, John, divinely moved by the Holy Spirit, wrote a pneumatikon evangelion. It's enough to condemn it, a spiritual gospel. In observing that the things obvious to the senses had been set forth in the earlier Gospels. That's a kind of a unique usage that Clement has of the word spiritual. He means by this that what he would call the biographical outward stuff is all known in the synoptic tradition. John is the one who gives us insight into what it all means. The spiritual gospel. Well, because of this, then John was considered a basic, reliable source and real history. Well, over the years, much of that changed. When I first set out to do my graduate work in the early 60s, John wasn't given the time of day by anybody as having anything to do with anything historical. Now, we need to face some realities here and then find out what we do with them. First of all, the differences with the synoptics are many and real. And so it has been argued that one cannot have history in both. And you can watch this happen in the history of New Testament scholarship as Mark's star rose, John's decline. And it finally came either John or Mark. You can't have history in both of these. And as Mark's was understood to be closer to the stuff historically, John's was considered less and less so as a work of history. But, and this was the craziness in this whole thing, and I consider it craziness. I was going to do my dissertation in this material, so I still have deep feelings about this stuff. But at the same time that they're dismissing John's gospel, they're also believing that John was dependent upon Mark and Luke. Now, that's where the rub comes, you see, because as long as there's a connection, let's see if I can illustrate this. As long as John's gospel is considered to be dependent on Mark and Luke, well, then you have this interesting way of looking at John's material, because there's so little in John that is even remotely parallel to Mark or Luke. I mean, once you've had the feeding of the 5,000, the walking on water, which he has in common with Mark, and the story of the woman that breaks the spikenard. And then, of course, the Passion narrative, and there's nothing in the Passion narrative that even closely corresponds to the Markan tradition in terms of, except what I call the essential events. The essential players in the game are there, but you understand that the narrative is just nothing Markan or Lucan about it at all. Well, there's this very, very, very little part of John's gospel that's dependent. So at this point, he's dependent upon them, and to the degree that he differs from them, then he's not historical. And that's simply, when I came into graduate school, that was, in fact, what was believed by scholarship. It was promoted, it was taught, it was just simply what I was given. Well, I consider this one of the interesting idiosyncrasies of New Testament scholarship. They start with the assumption because the differences are so great, one cannot have history in both. Since Mark is more historical and less theological, therefore he is the more trustworthy. Nonetheless, despite all the differences between them, in a very few instances, there are some verbal similarities that indicate that he was in fact indebted to them after all. Therefore, not only could it not have been written by an eyewitness, but everything that differs is the creative genius of a later writer-theologian. Fascinating bit of historical approach to things. Now, the search for the author, of course, then ruled John out of hand. He was not there. So, all of my schooling, I was subjected to the fact that John's Gospel was written by John the Elder. In fact, you can read the 1911 Britannica for one of the clearest expositions of this John the Elder that you'll ever find. And it's all a fabrication on the fact that Papias speaks about somebody he calls the Elder John, from whom these traditions come from. And you've got this large article on John the Elder, as if this person were a historical figure that you could go and meet someday. Amazing stuff. Well, just about the time that I was in the process of doing this and got sidetracked into text criticism along the way, J.A.T. Robinson, again, honest to God, John Archibald Thomas Robinson, he wrote this little piece called The New Look on the Fourth Gospel. And this was kind of like a bombshell in the scholar's playground. It is the kind of thing that had to be written because the time was ripe for it, and it took a guy like Robinson to get away with it. And he just simply dropped it in the playground and said, look, the whole thing is backwards. Everything we've said about John. And what he argued is that the clearest evidence is that John is independent of the synoptic tradition, but that he also there's good reason to believe that there's all kinds of what I call genuine historical memories going on in here. If that's the case, he argues, then we've got to put John's Gospel very early. If not the Gospel, at least the stuff that's in the Gospel. And so he argued that now you've got an independent source that goes back at least as early as Mark and Q. Well, not everybody believed that, but you understand, nobody can ever go back to the days that I lived any longer. Despite the fact that we still have some who are about arguing that John used Mark. Of all the crazy reasons, because there are three very peculiar words in John's Gospel. What is it? Spikenard and something else in the 5,000 that are so unusual that he had to have known Mark in order to use it. Well, I don't know what to do with that kind of reasoning. I was telling somebody the other day, in my book on the Spirit in Paul, I came across this argument that Paul, of all things, I don't know what to do with this kind of stuff, and I bite my tongue to keep from saying it badly. But of all the crazy ideas that Paul is indebted to a document known as the Wisdom of Solomon for his pneumatology. Well, it just so happens that the Wisdom of Solomon mentions the Holy Spirit twice. And he mentions it in an obscure passage which has three words that are like words Paul uses in one passage on the Spirit in 1 Corinthians 2, 6-16. And that isn't even the heart of Paul's pneumatology. And that happens to be something that's a little, what I call, off the way. I mean, a very important passage on Paul's pneumatology, because it is off the way, but it's off the way in terms of what I call the heart of things. And to argue that Paul is dependent upon the wisdom of Solomon, when all you have to do is read the Old Testament and read Paul, and you can find out overnight where Paul gets his pneumatology. He sees Jesus and the Spirit as the fulfillment of the eschatological promises of the gift of the Spirit and the gift of the renewal of God's presence. And none of that can be found in the Apocrypha or pseudepigraphic stuff. It all comes out of the Old Testament. But because of this one, kind of word similarity, Paul's dependent upon and derives his pneumatology from the wisdom of Solomon. I don't know what to do with scholarship that does things like that with sources. I mean, the fact that Mark and John happen to have a very unusual word for spikenard hardly says that John is dependent on Mark, or he couldn't have written his gospel. All it says is that that's probably the well-known name for this particular spikenard, and it ended up in both traditions. That is a very easy explanation, and the idea that John knew or used Mark. Now, I don't know whether John knew him or not, but if he knew him, he didn't use him. That much, surely anybody that looks at the sources together ought to be able to say with a great deal of strong affirmation. John is independent of the synoptics. Well, in any case, the search for authorship most recently has been eclipsed by other questions, namely sources, composition, historicity, some of which we'll get to. Let me just conclude on this whole matter. And the problem is complex for me because we also have to include the apocalypse, the revelation, which also comes from the same Johannine circle. Now, as to the composition of John's Gospel, whatever the sources, the present work in its final form is the product of a single hand that has pressed his style and vocabulary on the whole. So much so that in one of those remarkable, not very well-known articles by a scholar named Pearson Parker back in the 40s, he said, the net result is that if John used sources, he wrote them all himself. And that little wry bit of scholarly humor is just what needed to be said. I mean, the present thing is so it's so Johannine that to try to pull sources out of this is just really, I don't know. It's being done, but I have to admit to a high degree of skepticism as to the success of our finding sources in John's Gospel. Having said that, however, there are just enough rough spots. And there are some real rough spots known as aporias. Chapter 21 or 1431. They sang a hymn and went out. And then you end up with 2 more chapters still in the upper room scene. And it's those kind of little things that make one wonder what's happening. Chapter 5, Jesus is in Jerusalem. He's in Galilee in chapter 6. But then the narrative in 7:21, he's back in Jerusalem and he's referring to the same miracle as in chapter 5, as if chapter 6 hadn't been there. You ask yourself, well, how will these people, there's a time gap between these. But the reader is certainly going to read the thing in chapter 7 as belonging to chapter 5. But you're not told how he gets there or anything, it just picks. You're told how he gets there, but the point is, it just simply picks up the same narrative with regard to that miracle as if there'd been no time gap at all. These kind of things happen throughout the gospel. So I'm convinced the final product is in fact redacted. That is, the final product is the work of somebody who put it in its present form as we now have it. Now, the fly in the ointment is the fact that the beloved disciple is always in the third person. He who has seen this has borne witness. He who has seen has borne witness, and that one knows that his witness is true. It's who that one is that we're having difficulty with. And then the one who bears witness is this third person, third party of some kind. Same thing in 21:24, and we know that his witness is true. So that the person who seems to be writing the gospel is referring to the one who wrote these things as somebody else. He wrote these things, and we know that that one's witness is true. So you've got this interesting way of referring to this person. And then there's the special problem of someone designating himself in this way. You can understand a disciple of the beloved disciple referring to him as the beloved disciple, but it's just a bit more difficult referring to yourself as the disciple whom Jesus loved. You know, you can understand why somebody else might say that on a regular basis about somebody in the third person. Anyway, the final thing for me is the fact that 21 verses 20 to 23 seem to reflect a time after the death of the beloved disciple. The whole point of that narrative, you understand, is how is it that the beloved disciple, that Peter who has died and Jesus hasn't come back. In any case, the very narrative indicates that the story is told because that one has now died and Jesus has not in fact come back, and it's a squaring away of that little bit of narrative. Jesus did not say what you think he said. He said something else. And it's very clear that the reason for that narrative is to clear up this bit of misunderstanding of this thing that's circulating with regard to the beloved disciple. Well, the final cruncher for me, of course, is the book of Revelation. The book of Revelation surely comes from the same milieu, but not from the same hand. The book of Revelation is written by somebody who wrote Greek as a second language. It is clearly second language Greek. The Gospel of John, somewhat that also, but it's a cleaned up rendition of such Greek. My guess is that John actually wrote the Revelation, and that he actually wrote what we know as the Gospel. That is, he is responsible for the narrative, or what I call the traditions, but that the person who actually wrote the Gospel in its present form was in fact a disciple of John, the beloved disciple, who wrote the Revelation. I wouldn't give my life for that solution, but that at least is my way of handling all the kinds of disparate data that one has to face in this particular matter. Now, the problem of sources. First of all, to look at the structure, because it differs from Mark considerably. And I point out the structure because this in itself is going to tell us an awful lot about where John fits into things. He begins with a prologue, which sets the stage with an interesting weaving of history and theology, mostly theology. His interest is, this comes at the place of the birth narratives in Mark and Matthew. Right where they have birth narratives, John has this incredible hymn sung to the Word that was with God, and became flesh and dwelt among us. So there's historical moments in that, you understand, but his interest is in the theological stuff that's going on. Now, the next section of the Gospel is the manifestation of the Word to the disciples. You have a series of 5 days in the life of the Messiah. It begins with John the Baptist, moves to some of John's disciples following Jesus, and they in turn announce Jesus as the Messiah. 141, we have found the Messiah. 149, you are the Son of God. You are the kind of Israel. That should be King of Israel, please. You are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel. Son of God. Now, you understand, there's no reason that couldn't have been said historically, because Son of God is a messianic term out of Psalm 2. Has nothing to do with the second person of the Trinity. You understand? It's just pure messianism. You are Israel's messianic king, the Son of God in Psalm 2 sense. Of course, when John writes it, he knows full well what Son of God means. And so John's Gospel is full of that kind of thing, where you've got this stuff that there's no reason to doubt that this is bedrock history. But surely when Nathanael said it, he couldn't have meant what the church later came to know. He was just giving messianic acclaim. Well, finally in 2:11 we're told that he manifested his glory and his disciples believed in him. So once we have this series of 5 days in the life of the Messiah, actually it's a 7-day scheme. I'm one of those who thinks that it's purposely 7-day scheme because of in the beginning, now you've got the new beginning, and the first beginning is a 7-day scheme, and now you've got a new 7-day scheme in which Jesus is manifested to some disciples who believe in Him because they see His glory. And once that happens, then there's the turning, and He manifests Himself to the world. Now, all the rest of the gospel is structured by the Jewish feasts. 2:13 to 4:54, the first Passover takes place in Jerusalem, although some of the later materials, Jesus leaves Jerusalem. 5:1 to 47, the unnamed feasts in Jerusalem. 6:1 to 71, chapter 6 in its totality, is second Passover takes place in Galilee. 7:1 to 9:41, the Feast of Tabernacles in Jerusalem. 10:1 to 42, the Feast of Dedication in Jerusalem. 11:1 to 12:50, prelude to the final Passover in Jerusalem. Then you have the double conclusion, the rejection of the Jews and the meaning of Jesus. And then the gospel concludes with John's passion narrative, which is the final Passover, in which Jesus' hour has come, and in the Johannine passion narrative, Jesus dies at the same time as the Paschal Lamb. So He fulfills the Passover. Now, it concludes then with a statement of purpose. These things are written. Many other signs did Jesus, which are not included in this gospel, but these signs are written so that you might believe that Jesus is the Messiah, and that the Messiah is none other than the Son of God, and that by believing that you might have life in His name. And then there's the epilogue explaining the death of the beloved disciple. Now, by any look at that, some things ought to jump off the page at you. First of all, the entire narrative, except for chapter 6 and a little bit in chapter 4, takes place in Jerusalem. Secondly, that John has all of Jesus' ministry, not only in Jerusalem, but he goes to Jerusalem several times in the narration of the gospel. Now, you do appreciate that when you read Matthew, Mark, and Luke, there is never a hint that Jesus ever goes to Jerusalem except once, and that's to die. There isn't even an outside hint that He's ever been to Jerusalem. He simply goes to Jerusalem to die. You think He goes many times because you read the synoptics with your understanding of John in hand. The Johannine narrative, it's clear that Jerusalem is where all of the action is. In fact, theologically, John even theologizes the saying of Jesus, where Jesus said, "A prophet is not without honor except in his own country." Now, in the synoptic tradition, that has to do with when Jesus is rejected in his hometown of Nazareth. And that's almost certainly when that happened historically. John's interest is not in the rejection in Galilee, it's his interest is in the rejection in Jerusalem. And for John, the true place of the Messiah, that is the true home of the Messiah, is Jerusalem. So it's when Jesus leaves Jerusalem that John now says, Jesus Himself had borne witness that a prophet is not without honor except in his own homeland, and he now clearly means Jerusalem. Now that's a theological reinterpretation of this saying of Jesus, based on the fact that the true home of the Messiah is Jerusalem, where all of the Messiah's activities take place, except for 3 short narratives. Now, there is no there's no Markan framework, therefore. And there is, how many of you know how long the ministry of Jesus took place? 3.5 years, right? Do you know how we know it was 3.5 years? You know I'm funning you by that, don't you? You know why we know it was 3.5 years? Because John narrates 3 Passovers. But there isn't a hint that John intends these to be successive Passovers on successive years. You understand? We don't know how long Jesus had public ministry. There's nothing in our sources to give us any hope except those 3 Passovers. And those 3 Passovers are so clearly theological for John that it's hard to construct a time sequence on the basis of John's narrative. If you only had John's gospel, you would never know Jesus was a prophet from Galilee. You would think that he spent all of his time in Jerusalem. If you had only Mark's the synoptic tradition, you think that Jesus spent all of his time in Galilee and went to Jerusalem only to die. Well, probably historical reality lies somewhere in between all of this. No reason to doubt that Jesus went to Jerusalem. After all, he was a good Jew. And good Jews did go to Jerusalem at pilgrimages on a regular basis. There's simply no reason at all to doubt that he went to Jerusalem. But the synoptic tradition gives none of that stuff. None of it. Except the last one. We don't know why. We don't know an awful lot about a lot of things when it comes to some of this. But the point to make then, of course, we're going to start talking about sources, is that the relationship then with the synoptics, and in terms of the relationship with the synoptics, the differences are many and they need to be noted. The Markan framework has almost totally disappeared. The only thing that remains of the Markan framework is the fact that John the Baptist is at the beginning, and even this differs considerably. We'll come back to that next lecture. There's an early call of disciples, but no hint that they are fishermen. There are some slight hints of early popularity and the theme of opposition, which comes simply from the Jews in John's Gospel. And the Jews is almost synonymous with the Judeans, you understand, in John's Gospel. In most instances, you can simply, and you understand that's the word in Greek, Judaioi, which means the Judeans. And you could, in many cases, just transliterate it, the Judeans, meaning the people from Judea. Jews, to be sure, but Jews of a very special ilk, the Judeans, who have trouble with this prophet from Nazareth. Well, there's the feeding of the 5,000, followed by the walking on water, followed by Peter's confession. And then there's the passion and resurrection at the end. That's the only thing left of the Markan narrative, which is, again, a way of saying that the Markan narrative is not where he is. Now, what differs is considerable. The whole scene of the ministry. His public ministry begins in Jerusalem. He makes 5 trips to Jerusalem, and almost everything takes place there. Secondly, and significantly, there is no messianic secret. Remember, this not only is the key to Mark's gospel, but it is absolutely kept with integrity in Matthew and in Luke. Jesus never lets anybody know who he is. And those who know are the demons, and he silences them. Well, in John's gospel, there is no secret of any kind. Right from day one, he is openly confessed as Messiah by John the Baptist in 1:29-34, no less than 4 times by 4 different messianic titles. By the disciples, by the Samaritan woman, by the 5,000. He openly declares himself as the Messiah, as the revealer of God, and the possessor of unique sonship. Now, I'd like to suggest to you, friends, that is really different from Mark. Then, the cleansing of the temple is the first public act in John's Gospel. It's the raising of Lazarus that leads to Jesus' death in John's narrative. And then you have the missing items. The narrating of the baptism, it's mentioned. That is, the fact that Jesus was baptized is mentioned because John says, the one on whom the dove said, I knew that he was. But that's just John's reference to it. There's no narration of it. There's no narration of the testing of the desert. There's no hint of casting out of demons. The transfiguration and the Lord's Supper are all missing. Well, also differing from the synoptics are the nature and form of Jesus' teaching. The kingdom of God lies at the heart of everything in the synoptics. In John, it's the person of Jesus. The synoptic Jesus speaks with short, pithy, memorable sayings, pronouncement stories. John, you have long, involved discourses with I am in them. In the synoptic tradition, there are parables. In John, you have symbolic language, but no parables. Now, you can understand the result of this, and this is just a cursory look. I mean, you start looking at the stuff closely, and it's, just add to this. Many scholars have therefore despaired of either harmonizing or of finding history in both. And therefore, they focused on his possible sources because, from their point of view, there can't be history here. So what do we do with sources in John? Well, with the abandonment of the conviction of any apostolic connection, the question is, where did he get his data? The older view that I've already mentioned, still held by many, including C.K. Barrett, the author was knowledgeable of and indebted to the synoptics and simply told his own story. The new look, that John is independent, therefore must be looked at as a possible source. And this must surely be the case, I suggest, since there is nothing in John that even remotely suggests an indebtedness to the synoptic tradition. So there are two possibilities as to sources. On the one hand, it is argued that there are two basic sources, what is called a semeia or signs source and a revelatory discourse source. These are the famous sources that Bultmann suggested. But very few scholars have bought the latter, that there's a revelatory discourse source. And many, the former, that is on the basis of style, would think that there might be a source there, and there's no reason to doubt that could be true. But, as I've indicated earlier, if John used sources, he wrote them all himself. So more likely what you have are either Johannine traditions, that is, traditions that ultimately stem from John, or else you have some other Jerusalem source, that is, a source of Jesus that stems from Jerusalem, and that simply that knows very little of Galilee except for the feeding of the 5,000 and the walking on the water. Interesting that that's the only Galilean narrative that he really... Well, the healing of the nobleman's son at the end of chapter 4 is also fit. So there's all three. Now, the real problem is the problem of history in John. What do we mean by history? And here, the German distinctions, which are very difficult to make in English, at least can help us to try to understand. Do we mean history? That is what we would call police report kind of history, precision, chronicle? Or do we mean Geschichte, the significance or the meaning, the story of the past with its significance? The point, of course, is that John is clearly the latter. There are several indications of this. First of all, John's own declared purpose. Compare John 20, 30, and 31 with Luke 1:1-4. Luke's purpose is patently historical. He says he's setting out to tell the story of what happened among us. That's the language of historical narration. In fact, you can find that language all through the historians. What happened among us? What took place? What transpired? That's historical interest. John's interest is as boldly theological. His interest is, what does it all mean? Listen to what he says of his purpose. Many other signs, not miracles, signs. The very choice of that word is a theological choice. Many other signs did Jesus, which are not included in this gospel. But these are included for a very theological purpose. That you might believe, first of all, that Jesus is the Jewish Messiah. And secondly, that the Jewish Messiah is none other than the Son of God. And third, that by believing this, you might come to have life in His name. Now that is as boldly theological as Luke's is patently historical. Now, this is not to say that he had no interest in history. But what is certain in John's case is that his is a history that is now understood after the fact. In fact, John's gospel is sort of what you would have expected to have happened in all the gospels. What I call the story of Jesus after the divine aha sets in. Now you understand, when you have the synoptic tradition and you read along, the disciples don't have a clue. Well, a certain clue. They come to believe He's the Messiah, but they have such a traditional view of what that means. There's no way they can fit Jesus even into that category. So they don't have the foggiest. What's going on right in their present? Comes the resurrection and they go, aha! And they go back and look with a completely different vision. But what is fascinating is that they tell the story from the other side of the divine aha. That is, they tell it from the perspective before they got the clue. which is remarkable indeed, you understand. Now that they know who He is, you'd have at least expected a little bit more of that to have gotten into the story. But very little of it gets in. These disciples are as dull can be. They just don't have a clue about Jesus, and that's the way the story comes to us. You'd have expected them to clean that up a bit maybe, but they don't. It's there, the way it was. But John's interest is in who He really was. Now that we know, let's go back and tell the story from that point of view. And that's exactly what he does. So it's the same story, not the same incidents, but the same story, but now in full light of what they came to know at a later point. And now he goes back and sees all of this with remarkable clarity. And so all of this now is history that is understood in light of the crucial event, namely the resurrection. To put it in Browning's remarkable poetry, referring now to the author of our gospel, what at first he saw as points, he now knew stars, and he has named them in the gospel he has writ. That's one of the more remarkable insights into John's gospel in the history of English literature. Now, there are plenty of explicit statements in the gospel that suggest this is so. And I've listed some of them. 2:22. When, therefore, Jesus was raised from the dead, His disciples remembered that He had said this. I mean, there's the kind of sentence that you've got just giving you the clue. Jesus said something, and it says, in effect, they didn't know what was going on then, but afterwards they clue. And it's clear that John is telling the story from the light of this after they came to know. 12:16, but when Jesus was glorified, then they remembered. 13:7, Jesus says to Peter, what I do now you do not know, but afterward you will understand. And then especially the Paraclete sayings. He, the Spirit, will teach you all things and bring all things to your remembrance that I told you. 16, 13, and 14. When He comes, He will guide you into all truth, and He will take from what is mine and declare it to you. All of those give us good clues as to what John himself is now understanding and is telling the story. Well, in light of that, just look at the nature of the discourses. There are these subtle changes of persons addressed. In the Nathanael narrative at the end of chapter 1, in verse 50, and I've had to put the Greek in here because for those with Greek, you have to see these singulars and plurals that don't come out in English very well. And he, Jesus, said to him, Nathanael, because I said to you, singular, you will see greater things than these. That's still second person singular. Now look at verse 51. Truly, truly, I say to you, plural, you, plural, will see. Now the gospel is full of this kind of thing, where there's this historical level, I singular, you singular, and then all of a sudden it becomes we, plural, and you, plural. It gives the red letter edition fits, because they can never quite tell when to stop the red letters, and when to, because Jesus is talking, and all of a sudden John is now interpreting what Jesus is meaning when he's talking. And you can't always tell where Jesus leaves off and John takes over, except by these little we, you, plural kinds of clues. 3:11, I say to you, singular, and you, plural, do not receive. So you have here in 3:1 to 15, look at these. I say to you, I say to you, I said to you. Verse 11 now. I say to you, singular, that what we have seen, we speak, and what we have seen, we bear witness to. That should be what we know we speak, not what we have seen. I'm doing that one in a hurry, and now that I'm looking at my English. What we know we speak, and what we have seen we bear witness to. Verse 12. I said to you, plural. I say to you, or I tell you. And then in verse 13 you've got this remarkable thing where Jesus is apparently speaking to Nicodemus, and he speaks about the Son of Man who is in heaven. And that became so distressing to some early scribes that Jesus should be speaking to Nicodemus and speaking about the Son of Man being in heaven currently, that they took that out. So we have a considerable textual variation. But almost certainly in this case, not something added by later scribes, but omitted because of their sense of how can Jesus be speaking to Nicodemus and talk about being in heaven at that moment. And the answer is that right in the middle of this narrative, the Jesus and Nicodemus narrative has become sort of transformed into John's own bearing witness about what Jesus is about. Now, the certain clue to this is when you get to verses 16 to 20, which in some of your red letter editions is still in red letters of all things, as if Jesus spoke those words, when in fact, those are the exact words and language of John, the author of 1 John. In fact, I can match up every bit of that with 1 John. This is not Jesus of Nazareth. This is the John who wrote 1 John, speaking in John 3:16 and following. Now, if that distresses some of you, just got to come to terms with the data, because that's the way it is. In fact, the thing that makes the Johannine stuff so difficult is that the Johannine Jesus doesn't talk like the Jesus of the Synoptics. He talks like the author of 1 John. I mean, you read 1 John and see for yourself. Jesus talks just like that author, in Greek. And you say to yourself, well, that's interesting, because the other sources don't give us an indication of that at all. Not always, of course. In the Johannine tradition, there are always a lot of those sayings of the synoptic kind. But overall, you have Jesus, yes, but Jesus now being retold or whatever. I don't know how to put that. You had the same thing at the end of chapter 3 with John the Baptist, and all of the end of chapter 3 is all Johannine. I mean, John, meaning 1 John stuff. Well, along with this, you have free shifts in chronology. I've already mentioned the one that Jesus, now in leaving Judea, John says that this is the way to understand that saying now. The cleansing of the temple takes place first. For John, for theological, not chronological reasons, please. John's got no interest in the chronology of this thing. He's interested in the fact that the very first public act of the Messiah is to go in Jerusalem to the main center of Jewish worship and stake it out as his own. This is where the Messiah reveals himself to Israel, in the temple, by cleansing it. That's a theological interest in the story, you understand, not a chronological one. He's not saying, oh, this is when it happened historically. At this point, we can't be sure whether John or Mark has the better of it as to when it happened. I tend to think Mark, but in the other, because that makes some good sense of some things that we'll come to when we talk about the Passion narrative. But the fact is, there's no reason to want to believe that John's interest is in chronology, since his interest is so clearly in theology at this point. Now, the point, you see, is that it isn't whether it happened or not. That's bedrock history. It's the significance of it that John is interested in. And the significance is that this is the proper place for the Messiah to manifest himself to his people. If the purpose of the gospel is you might believe that Jesus is the Messiah, then the proper place for the Messiah to do his Messiah thing is the very first public act. And you notice that's in John's gospel. The first public act is in Jerusalem, cleanses the temple, and then says, destroy this body, and in 3 days I'll raise it. Well, you're just full of Johannine theology in that. The interest is in the significance of it. Well, that leads us then to his use of the word semeion, sign. All of the miracles are called signs in John. The reason is they all point beyond the event to greater meaning. Look at the very first of them, 2:1-11. It is absolutely imperative, crucial to the story, that you read verse 6. It's the clue to the story. 6 stone jugs for Jewish purification rites. 6, not 7, 6 stone jugs. Holding, John says, 2 or 3 measures each. The word for measure, translated firkin, I think, in the King James, probably means 20 to 30 gallons. I mean, you're talking about an enormous supply of wine. And where does the wine come from? From the water jugs of Jewish purification rites. Don't miss that. So they take this wine. Out of this water comes wine. They take this wine to the Mater Dei. He goes to the person who's put on the feast and says, "Hey, you've got this all backwards, Mac." He said, you always give the best wine first, and then when it's played out, then you can give the poorer wine because, they're not able to distinguish fine wines after a bit. You don't have to use this good stuff. He says, "You've kept the best wine till now." And with that, the story ends. Well, of course. That's the whole point for John. Out of Jewish purification water has come the wine of the eschatological age, where when the Messiah comes, the hills are going to flow with sweet wine. And they've kept the best wine till now. And when the disciples saw that, they believed in him because they saw his glory. Well, the interest isn't the fact that Jesus can turn water into wine. The interest is in the fact that in turning that water into wine, there is the fulfillment of Jewish eschatological hopes that the hills that flow with sweet wine are now taking place, and it comes right out of Judaism, right out of the purification water jugs. Well, it happens all the way through John's Gospel that way. Every single event in John's Gospel can be understood and interpreted in light of something that goes on in Jewish ritual with regard to the feasts. Everything. Whatever's going on in the Jewish feasts, tabernacles, Passover, dedication, Jesus stands on the scene and says, "I'm the fulfillment of all this." If you don't understand that, friends, you don't read John's Gospel well. Do you understand? The whole joy of John's Gospel is that Jesus is the Jewish Messiah, and he's demonstrated to be so because he fulfills every single eschatological expectation associated with the Jewish feasts, and in Jerusalem primarily. That's theology. I'm not saying that's not history, but you understand the history is what I call the stuff that gets the theology underway. Our interest is in who Jesus really was, not just in taking a picture of Jesus back then and there. Well, along with that, then finally, is his heavy use of symbolism, and especially the double meaning of words, many of which can only happen in Greek. Except you be born anothen. Well, anothen is a perfectly ambiguous word in Greek. It can either mean again or from above. And the whole point of the narrative is the play on that word. John hears again, Jesus meant from above. Nicodemus says, "How in the world can a man be born a second time when he's old?" That's born again. Jesus says, "Except a man be born from above, by the Spirit, he can't see anything." So the whole wordplay is on this meaning of this word. We'll take the word hupsotheni, verse 3:14. Except the Son of Man be, and now the word can simply mean lifted up, or it can mean exalted, glorified. In John's Gospel, you have to appreciate, you know where Jesus is glorified? On the cross. That's what I call the great moment of the triumph of John's theology. In John's Gospel, to cite the Latin text now, the cry of Jesus on the cross is "consummatum est," tetelestai in the Greek, but the Latin is so much more understandable. It is consummated. So whenever John speaks about Jesus being glorified, he's referring to the fact that he's going to be glorified in his death. Because when he's lifted up in death and glorified, that is when people will turn to him. I mean, this is a remarkable understanding of Jesus' death. And it isn't that he takes the tragedy out of it either. It's just that he sees the significance of it. Here is God's glory being manifested in our world. So except the Son of Man be hupsotheni, meaning lifted up on the cross, but obviously when He's lifted up on the cross, He's exalted on the cross. So, all the way through John's Gospel. Well, the prologue itself tells us what to expect from the outset, doesn't it? It starts with a hymn to a pre-existent Word who became flesh and is the revealer of the Father. Well, my time is up. Let me just conclude this final page. Thus, John tells his story unapologetically, with a later understanding in full view. Nonetheless, and now here's where history comes in, his Christ is not docetic. And by docetic, I mean He appears to be human, but He's really only God. John will have nothing to do with the docetic Christ. He is, in fact, a very historical, real Jesus, in the sense of belonging to our real world and history. He became flesh and dwelt among us. 6'4", wearied of His journey, He sat to rest. He weeps at a graveside. Now, John's concern is with the Messiah, whom he now knows to be the Son of God. But it is Jesus of Nazareth who is the Christ. That's the point. The story doesn't work, you understand, if it is not rooted in bedrock history of Jesus of Nazareth. It is the story of Jesus as we now come to see it and understand it from what I call the divine insight that has been given to them. Two conclusions, therefore, about history and John. His traditions have every mark of genuine historical memory. In fact, you'll see me in the next lecture appeal to the Johannine stuff as the best way to make sense of some stuff that is otherwise, I think, obscure in the synoptic tradition. Perfectly good sense, because there's genuine historical memory. And these parts that I'm referring to, Jesus knew His disciples before He called them. You understand how much more sense that makes than the picture you get in Mark? Jesus goes by and never met these guys before and says, "Follow me!" And whoo, they get up and follow Him. I mean, John gives us a picture that he knew them for a while. And now you get the later picture. He says, "Follow me!" And so they drop everything and follow. That makes sense. There's a simultaneous and contemporary work with John at the river you'd never catch in the synoptic tradition. This considerable ministry in Jerusalem, of course, it makes sense that there should have been such a ministry. The day of the crucifixion, different from the synoptics, but seems more realistic historically in the Johannine picture. The fact of a Samaritan ministry is going to make some sense of some other things that happened later in Samaria in the book of Acts. And the unbelief of Jesus' brothers, which is sort of hinted at in the synoptic tradition, but never spelled out as clearly as in the Johannine. Now, the language in which the Johannine Jesus expresses himself is most often that of John. But there is no reason to doubt the essence of what is said. You understand, it's the kind of thing that goes on over and over again, and we never doubt what we call history. You leave this class and you start talking. Dr. Fee said, and then you repeat what I said in your words. And nobody says, "No, that's not what he said." It doesn't matter what I said those very words or not. You're now expressing what was said in your own language. We do this all the time because the precision of the exact words is not the point. And so it comes out, I grant you, in John's language. But there's no reason to doubt the essential nature of the stuff. All of that to say then finally about the Johannine Jesus. In my survey course, I suggest the difference between a photograph and a portrait. In some ways, the portrait is the more true representation. Now, you and I tend to think otherwise. Nothing like a photograph for us. But in this class, that is when I talk about the truer representation, I mean, there's something about a portrait, because the portrait gives us not only the person who is being portrayed, but we see it through the eyes of someone. And there's always something to be said for that over against a photograph, unless it's, of course, portraiture-type photography. But in this class, our primary interest is in the portrait. Is in the photograph, not the portrait. My interest is going to be plenty in the photograph. I'm in the portrait. It's too late. Anyway, my interest is in the Johannine Jesus, obviously. But our primary interest is in that picture that emerges that we could see if we were there to take pictures of, if we possibly could. We are surely more likely in touch with Jesus as we would have seen him before the resurrection in the Synoptics, and all of our other sources are alike here, but in some ways, and in fact for me, the most profound ways of all, the Johannine Jesus is the real picture, not to negate the others. Okay, we'll pick it up next time with that brief look at those other sources, and then march on with the story.